As you learned in the previous read aloud, while they continued to hunt, fish, and gather, many native people also began to farm. This was a very important development that changed native people's way of life quite significantly, or importantly. They began to plant and harvest crops such as squash, beans, and maize, or corn. Farming added to the food supply and allowed some groups of people to have the choice to stay in one place instead of migrating or following their prey. Native people's knowledge and understanding of nature, particularly of the plants, was acquired over many years. Over time, they experimented with growing local grasses and gourds. Eventually, many of them developed the ability to grow a wider variety of plants. In addition to increasing their food supply by farming, native people also began to use plants to make such things as clothing, medicine, homes, and household items. They began to raise animals such as turkeys while continuing to hunt, gather, and fish. And so, after a long period of time, many native people, having migrated across North America, came to live in groups called tribes. Each tribe had its own name, language, and set of beliefs, and overall cultural identity. How each tribe lived, the clothes the tribe members wore, the foods they ate, and the homes they lived in depended greatly upon the environment in which they lived. This is especially true of language. Different words were created that related significantly to regional beliefs and habitats. And so the languages of these native people became widely different from region to region and from tribe to tribe within that region. Trade brought native people from different regions together, and a greater understanding of farming techniques spread. When tribes from different regions met to trade, they not only shared their ideas of farming techniques, they also traded crops and seeds. In this way, tribes began growing crops that were not native to the region in which they lived. With a more reliable food supply and the ability to store corn for 2 or 3 years to be used when there was not a good harvest, the population of native people in North America began to increase, and large settlements began to develop in different regions. That is not to say that all tribes settled in one place, however. Some, such as the Shoshone, Cheyenne, and Blackfoot of the Central Plains, never really settled in a true sense of the word. They chose a nomadic existence. They moved around, following the enormous herds of buffalo that moved with the seasons. The buffalo provided them with everything they needed, including food, clothes, and the teepees in which they lived. It is believed that at one time, more than 30 million buffalo roamed parts of North America. The culture of these Central Plains tribes grew out of their nomadic lifestyle. Other groups, such as the Southeastern Cherokee and Northeastern Iroquois, moved from place to place in the wintertime when the earth would not yield any food, and the hunting was the only way to survive. Tribes such as these returned to their settlements in the spring. Nevertheless, once large native populations began to live in settlements, there came the need for new rules. These rules were designated to help a large number of people live together in one place. And so, native tribes created their own unique governing systems. Generally, elected leaders or strong family groups were responsible for establishing tribal laws and making sure they were obeyed. Spiritual leaders also guided their communities and participated in the decision-making process. Eventually, individual tribal laws, languages, clothing, customs, and religious beliefs began to set them apart from each other. For all tribal groups, their day-to-day activities and the construction of their homes were largely determined by the region in which they lived and the local resources available to them. Consequently, their cultural identity became linked to a specific region. For example, some of the tribes living in the Great Plains, an enormous area of grassland, did not have the abundance of trees to use for buildings. Instead, some homes were made out of soil, grass, and roots, whereas others were made out of animal hides and were called teepees. In the Southwest, native people called the Pueblo used clay bricks and stone to create tall Pueblo dwellings. They learned how to farm with a limited or small water supply. The Iroquois tribe of the Northeast, where the trees were abundant, built long houses out of wood and bark and provided warm shelters during the cold and snowy winter months. They hunted the animals of the forest, such as deer and rabbits, and wore animal furs in the wintertime. Southeastern tribes lived close to the coast, on lush hills, and in the mountains. The Southeast fishermen, as well as Native Americans in other regions, built boats, set nets and traps in the rivers, and hunted fish with spears. Farmers grew corn, beans, and squash. They also raised sunflowers and tobacco. Their homes were made from mud and clay with roofs of brush and sometimes river cane. On the northwest coast, native tribes would build plank houses using long, flat planks or boards of cedar wood, which grew in great abundance in the region. They relied on the bountiful or large supply of fish, including salmon, as well as seals and porpoises. They even hunted whales. In the Arctic and subarctic regions, the Inuit also hunted whales and continued to perfect indigenous ways of surviving in this often frozen land, including building igloos, which you will hear more about later. Although cultural identity was determined in large part by the region in which the group was located, that does not mean that all the groups within a region shared the exact same culture. Within each region, there were some cultural differences from one tribe to another, just as there are differences among people within state or regions today. Clothes were made from local resources too, and varied enormously from region to region. Furs and animal hides were worn in the colder regions and on the Great Plains. Cloth woven from plant fibers were common in the warmer regions, and local plant dyes were used to embellish clothing and possessions. Many Native Americans also embellished their skin with markings, piercings, and tattoos. As the people of each tribe developed their own language, they told stories about their own history. They handed down their history from one generation to the next in this way. They created their own unique fables and mythological tales to help explain the world in which they lived. They celebrated life, worshipped a variety of nature gods, and gave thanks to the resources planet Earth provided for them. By the time Christopher Columbus and other Europeans arrived to North America, thousands of years later, the journey that probably began with the nomadic people following herds of prehistoric mammals had brought about the creation of a very different world than that of the Europeans. It was a world that included many hundreds of unique native tribes, farming, trade, diverse or different cultures, and the building of immense ceremonial mounds. Native tribes were now dispersed or spread out all across North America. Because Christopher Columbus thought that he had arrived in part of Asia called the Indies, he called these native people Indians. However, they never referred to themselves as Indians.